Okay, I think we'll get started with our second part. If you want some tea or some coffee, like I said, there is some over there. This text, you'll probably want to keep a Bible close by or to bring a Bible with you, because it definitely relies much more on having the text of the scriptures in front of you. Our other books included the text of the gospel in each chapter, but this one doesn't. And sometimes it covers kind of a lot. So there are several puzzles in this that hopefully we can bring some light to. Some of it is a very unfamiliar culture, very unfamiliar landscape when it comes to how things worked. So the text talks a little bit about writing and Psalms and how that Israel is a culture over time that becomes much more dedicated to a culture of the Word, a culture of the book, than not. I mean, it points out rather rightly, although mistakenly, that literacy is something that we live with now, but historically it wasn't as high. Now, there's all kinds of evidence to show that the ancient world, particularly cultures that were dedicated to it, was a bit more literate than we give them credit for. Maybe not to read tracts of Shakespeare, but there are enough of them that knew how to write basics, knew how to read basics. And especially in Judaism, when you have the development of the synagogues, that really takes off. Do you remember when synagogues come about? We've mentioned this many times. Synagogues develop in the Babylonian exile. So 586 BC is when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, and they're taken in a series of about 20 years off to exile in Babylon. That is a time where they work hard at maintaining their identity and developing their identity. And they develop synagogues as places where the Word of God, where these scrolls that had been written that were accepted as the words of God, where they are copied and kept and spread. So that comes about, you could say, in the middle of the, I suppose that's the 5th century BC. I don't know, sometimes the numbers work funny. 6th century BC, 5th century BC, whatever. Like 550 BC, give or take. That's the development of the synagogue. In the story of Ruth, we're probably about 600 years before that. So remember that there is a long passage of time in these books and in this early part of the Bible. At this time, this is the time of the judges. There's no strong central government. There's no organizing polity or political society. It's judges. It's individual groups of people. There's tribal affiliations. Tribes were related mostly by blood. You know, there was genealogy involved, but there's no strong central government. And in this time, a dude named Elimelech goes to Moab. So Elimelech would be, I suppose, the great grandfather of David. He is a man of Judah. And if you remember, like, Christian history aids you a lot in this, because Jesus is in the line of David, and David is of the tribe of Judah. David, his ancestral city is Bethlehem, which is what features in this story of Ruth. So there's a famine, and Elimelech has to flee. Now, Moab is a country on the southeast side of the Dead Sea. So it's not very nice country. It's not very well-watered country. It's not a good place to grow things. This is the southern end of Jordan, if you look on a map today. It's not a place that you would go because you're on vacation. It's a place that you would go because you need to. And historically, geographically, I don't know what the word is for weather, but meteorologically, this area of Moab would be drier and more difficult to live in than Bethlehem. But Israel is subject to sort of dramatic weather changes. It's been that way for a long time. They can have somewhat wet weather, and it can be more fertile, but then it can get very dry, and very dry for years at a time. This seems to be a situation of that. And Moab, they weren't very friendly with Israel. Moab is one of the descendants of Esau. So if you remember, like Abraham is the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, and Esau. And Jacob steals Esau's birthright. So Moab is one of those that are children of Esau. There's a lot of historical animosity, sort of blood feud, you would call it, in ways that we don't have so much the same way. Well, some of you did, with the neighboring towns. But a lot of that has died out in the younger generation. I mean, even the mentality of our whole culture has changed. There was a day where going to the Christmas dinner at the Lutheran church down the street was, a mortal sin that might get you thrown in prison, and you might not be able to go to heaven if you go to more than one. And now, in a lot of small towns, they all go to each other's dinners. It's just what they do. So that has changed. But there's a symbolism. They have to flee from the city of the house of bread. That's what Bethlehem means, the house of bread. And they go to a land of desert. That doesn't bode very well, usually. The sons take Moabite wives. So there's Naomi and Elimelech, and then two sons. I didn't put their names in because they disappear from the story almost immediately. And they take Moabite wives. Now, if you're reading the Old Testament, that would be like the ringing of a bell in a not so good way, like the ominous sounding bell. Because you're not supposed to marry foreign women. Why are you not supposed to marry foreign women? Because they have different gods and it's very easy for your heart to start to drift away from the covenant when you're in a marriage like this. Think about our own days. People have interfaith marriages have become much more common. But very often what you see when you look at it is the loss of faith. What you see if you have one spouse that comes from a kind of practicing background and one that doesn't, it doesn't take too long, most of the time, for them both to stop. And rarely does it seem to work out very well. Most of the time, it takes the two of them ending up in the same spot. Either one, they both become Catholic, or sometimes, we might not like it as much, but a Catholic becomes a Lutheran or another one, but they do it together. This is what it is talking about, like biblical proof. The proof is in the pudding. And I'm not saying that in condemnation or that people are horrible, but it's just like, we like to say that it doesn't make a difference and it's all about love, and yet when you look at the situation from the outside and you just look at it statistically, it's like, oh, this is fairly accurate. When you marry someone, you tend to drift together. And if that means, that you marry someone with less faith than you tend to drift in that direction. And, we work hard at trying to educate and help people to grow into that. It's part of marriage preparation and some of those things. But the problem of intermarriage is one that hasn't really gone away. And so you have these two sons who take Moabite wives, and in the story, that wouldn't be so good. This would be not, the Bible's not going to be a fan of this. You would think, that's how it would be set up. This is against the law of Moses. But in this case, it doesn't quite work out that way. So, very shortly, Elimelech and the two sons die. So you have three women left, Naomi and Orpah and Ruth. Now they would be in sort of what you would call big trouble. They are up the creek without a paddle because they're widows and they're living in a foreign land, and they probably don't own a lot. They don't have a definite source of income. And into this situation, they hear of food in Judah again. Now there's questions in the background of this book. Like if you were starting at this point in your mind, how could you answer, why is this book in the Bible? So far, it's the story of an average family in an average place. Why is this story in the Bible? I'll claim the easy answer before you do, because he's part of the line of David. But that's the easy answer. What's another one?
Relationship. Because they are normal, regular people, and we're supposed to be learning our path to God, from God, and we assume that we're normal, regular people too.
So that they would be an example for us, that they're normal people, that we're learning that kind of thing. Yeah?
I think it's the relationship between Naomi and Ruth.
The relationship between Naomi and Ruth. That's another good one. Bringing someone who's not an Israelite into the story, that the Gentiles are part of the covenant people of God too, or at least they can be. I think that's a part of it, yes.
Would she be an example of a godly woman?
An example of a godly woman. What you find very quickly in the story is that Naomi talks about, may the Lord bless you in what you have done. It sounds like she is a fairly devout woman. And in a way, the book is speaking to that a little bit. It's sort of the perennial problem, why do bad things happen to good people? Here you have a woman, Naomi, and her husband, Elimelech, and his name could be his name, but like a lot of biblical names, it's also symbolic. Elimelech means, my God is king. So you have this man and his wife that seem to be somewhat devout. In fact, the whole story is very, very striking because of how devout the people of Bethlehem are. They respond in rather odd ways when we get into the story a little bit. And so there's this question, if these are devout people and they're praying to God, you would expect that God would take care of them. And they ended up in a foreign land, and all of their source of sustenance died, and now they're widows and foreigners. So this God person better intervene fairly quickly, because this is not going so well. And it continues actually to not go so well for a little bit. But Naomi proves herself faithful. She talks about, may the Lord bless you in what you do. She honors these women who became part of her family, and she tries to send them back to their own families. Why would she do that? So she could take care of them, so they could find other husbands. Because she's going back to Judah. How likely are 2 Moabite women to be accepted in Judah? It's not likely that they're going to be able to find husbands there, because Jewish society is very conservative. There's this prohibition against marrying foreign women. I don't know why they never have marrying foreign men. Maybe because women are far more faithful and can practice the faith better than men do. But marrying foreign women is frowned upon. And so if they come back with her, they'll be widows and foreigners and fatherless. They'll be divided from their families. At least if they're with their families in their own country, they would possibly be able to find another spouse or another mate. But in Israel, it's far less likely. And they object. They don't want to go back to their families. They want to cling to Naomi. And they both do this at first. Seems like it's a good family to be a part of. There's a lot of kinship. There's a lot of bond here. That they're not just the mothers and the daughters-in-law that are, sort of friends behind steel fences and iron gates with swords and pickaxes. It's a closer relationship than that. Sometimes in-laws can be special. Sometimes in-laws can work out very well. I came from, my parents' families both got along together. And it's interesting that they were very different, and so sometimes it didn't always feel very friendly, but in the end they were. That isn't always the case. But they want to return with Naomi. Now Naomi decides very quickly that she's not going to remarry. It's like the love of her life has died and she is going to remain single. But here you start to see another dimension of the story. She says later, "Do not call me Naomi, but call me Mara," which means bitter. And part of the story is the redemption, the resurrection of Naomi. She goes from being bitter to being full of joy and taken care of. And she is as lost in her bitterness as anything else. Like, she's one of these people where it's like her whole life just melted before her, and now what? And she's trying to pick up the pieces and caught in grief and caught in sorrow and really wrestling with it all. So Orpah decides to leave, but Ruth remains. She says, "Your people will be my people, your God will be my God." Now again, think of what a statement of faith that is. For Ruth, it probably means leaving her family and leaving her culture. Since they're not very culturally friendly, this could be a fairly permanent break. We don't know. The people of Judah that are at the heart of this story seem to be a bit friendlier with the Moabites than the Benjaminites and some of the other Israelites were. But it very well could be like leaving her family forever, that she's saying goodbye to everything that she ever knew. Why would she do that? Why do you make a choice like that? This is the kind of choice that few of us have had to make, but when you do, it's pretty incredible. She could have been treated better with Naomi and Naomi's husband than her own family. She could care about her mother-in-law. That's another good answer. So her faith, I suspect at least that I would put an emphasis there as well. I think those other pieces are true, that she probably was treated better, that Judaism has that kind of thing. But for Ruth, she becomes a pretty stunning woman of faith. This discovery of one God, a God of the covenant, a God who speaks to his people, a God to be in relationship with, seems to be something that she's unwilling to let go of. She says, your people will be my people, your God will be my God. She is sacrificing, she is laying down her upbringing and her worship of foreign gods. Some of the stories today, if you want to read things that speak of the terrible cost of this, look at some of the Muslim converts to Christianity and their stories. For some of them, it means never talking to their family again. It means being cut off, in some cases even being subject to being killed or murdered. And there are people who decide that knowing Jesus and living in relationship with him is worth all of that. That he is worth more than everything else that you have. That's a pretty strong statement of faith. That's one that I wonder how many of us would be ready to make ourselves. If following Jesus was going to cost you everything, your home and stability and society and friends and family, would you do it? I hope I don't get asked that question. Because that's hard. That's not an easy time. So they returned to Bethlehem. Naomi is a name that means beautiful. It's actually one of my favorite women's names. I wish that there would be more women named Naomi. Because it's just, there's something, I don't know, it's a good name. Better than some of the modern ones. Sometimes I look at modern ones and I'm like, what does that mean? And the best answer you can give, we don't know. Sometimes I think names are chosen because they sound nice, which is important, I will admit, but it's just like, but meaning's important too. And I don't know, I'm not involved in naming people, but I think Naomi also shows us, like, part of this problem or part of this story is a woman caught in despair, is a woman caught in depression. And that can be a very real example as well. That it can become a kind of consuming bitterness. It can become kind of a getting lost. And part of her being found is the story as well. I think that this book points to a few things, and there's a few other things that we can add. When you feel yourself down, if this is something that you struggle with, bringing your heart to the Lord is one of the first things. That God ultimately proves himself faithful. The book of Ruth is a great example. You could sort of hold it up in your prayer and say, see, God, look at this. This is your Bible. You did this for Ruth. She was in despair and she was in darkness, and you heard her prayers and brought her to restoration. Seeking friends and those around you who can offer support. That's extremely important. When you feel like you're in despair, it's very alienating and very isolating. You feel very alone. That's part of the poison of it, I think. And to choose to open your heart to other people, to choose to expose some of these areas in your heart that are tender, that's a hard thing. That's a vulnerable thing. But it's also a place where if you do, you can find support. You can find people that are with you. You can find people that can't replace and can't fix everything that's wrong, but that's a beautiful gift. Good friendship works. It's a kind of medicine in the heart for despair. Another one is taking care of basics. Basics. Any good psychologist worth their salt, any good person should tell you that when you're in a place of despair or darkness or loneliness, You want to try and make sure that you're getting enough sleep, that you're eating regular meals at regular times, and you're getting some exercise. Because those help take care of biology. They're part of what your body and basic biological life needs for flourishing. So if you take care of those, it might not feel like it's helping, it might not feel like it's working, but it's very, very important. I told my counselor a while ago that bad moods rarely survive long runs. You know, exercise releases a whole bunch of feel-good chemicals in your body, and sometimes, despite yourself, the world just doesn't seem as dark after you exercise for a while. That's biology. That's just body chemicals. And it doesn't always change the situation, but sometimes it can help give you the strength to address the other things that are needed. But I think we all have these. We all have these in our lives. We all have times that are hard like this. And I think the example of Naomi and this book is a good chance to pray with it and to hear some of it, to think about and ponder what are good things. Because very often when you're feeling sick or alone, it's easy to turn to television, to be on your own, closed windows, no light in the house, not a lot of energy, you don't do things. And that becomes a sort of downward spiral. And these kind of things, I should have put open your windows. But there's a great story that I read one time of a man that got very, very sick and was staying at home. And one day he had a friend who came over and picked him up and took him outside, and ignored every protest and every reason why that was a bad idea and every problem with it. And after that, his health began to improve. And this friend started dragging him outside, because just getting out of the house and doing things, as much as you're convinced it's not going to work, remember that kind of like Naomi, once you're caught in bitterness, it can be bitterness talking. Once you're caught in despair, it can be despair talking. And it'll shoot down every good possibility. Oh, you won't enjoy that. Oh, it's not going to work. Oh, it's going to be painful. And you just sort of have to stab that in the face and watch it die. Because it's not true. It's part of the lie of getting caught in these kind of emotional things. All right, so it's the beginning of the barley harvest. Now, the grain harvest is something, so this is part of the context of the story and something that I think you have to understand. Did anyone look up grain harvesting in ancient Israel because they were curious? 1. We have victory. Shar will teach lessons to the rest of you with a whip. This is the kind of thing that I hope you become a little bit more familiar with, of like, wait a minute, I don't know anything about grain harvesting in ancient Israel. I hope you thought that at least, because that was my thought, like, I've never harvested grain in my life. I've ridden around in a combine a few times with farmers that have done it, but that's it.
My sister actually put grain in bundles this year because it was so wet out in the with her or some people around her, because it was so wet that they ended up putting it in bundles so that it would, like bundles like they did, so that it would shed the rain.
Yeah. So when you get to grain harvest, this is an activity that the whole community was a part of. There's very, very few people that weren't involved in grain harvest. Even the youngest of children would be expected to help. So in grain harvesting, the field grows and they go out. Usually men would go by and cut heads of grain with a scythe. Or there's another name for it. What's the other name for it? A sickle. Either one. But they would cut heads of grain, swing it, this giant thing with a sharp blade. And then it would be gathered, often by women, into bundles to dry. These are called sheaves, usually. Sometimes in later England, they're called shooks. but they would gather the stalks into bundles and tie them up to let them dry. And then they would be brought to a threshing floor. Now, in Israel, this is one of the real puzzles, and who knows why they did it this way, but this is what they did. So they'd bring these bundles in, and they'd untie them, and then they'd usually harness an ox and have a big slab of something that they would put sharp things on the bottom of, like sharp bits of obsidian or glass or metal. And then they would march this ox around the threshing floor, and it would cut the stalks of grain and start mashing up the heads a little bit, because you have to separate the head of the grain from its casing around the seeds, and you have to separate the heads from the straw. So it would cut it up a little bit, and they'd march around with this ox for a while, and they had to haul the grain from the field to the threshing floor. And then they would take, after the ox was done, they'd wait for a windy day, and they would take it, and they had big pitchforks, and they'd fling it into the air. And the wind would blow the chaff, the bits of stuff that were really useless, away furthest. They were the lightest weight. And then the second set would be the straw. That would blow away somewhat, but fall sooner. And straw would be saved and collected and used for brick making, or for feeding animals, or for using for animals. It's probably what they made a lot of beds out of, was straw, because it was dry and not subject to mold as easily. And then the grain would fall closest. The grain would fall out of the air soonest. So you have this sort of long process that's involved. And it's important to have that kind of context in the background, because it's exactly what happens in the story. So gleaning is another part of it. In Israel, you were prohibited by the law of God from going over your field twice. You had one shot to do it, and that was it, because what was left over was for the widow and the orphan and the fatherless. That in the way that God makes his covenant with his people, you have to care for the widows and the orphans and the fatherless, because they're the most disadvantaged. They're called the Anawim, the poor ones, because they don't have the same opportunity to have land, or to participate in the harvest, or to raise grain, or all of these other things. So you could only do one pass, and then everything that's left is for them. So Naomi comes back with her daughter-in-law, in this case Ruth, and it notes that Boaz is this rich